Today, we are going to look at Karens that died in stupid ways, from a holiday party guest who kicked a cooler and plummeted to her death, to a shopping center confrontation that ended in a crushing tragedy when someone forgot to put their car in park. It was July 4th, 2017, at Lake Lanier, Georgia. A crowded holiday gathering filled a narrow wooden dock with music, coolers, and constant movement between boats, while submerged hazards below the surface went largely unnoticed. Pamela Rhodes was 49 years old and worked in an office support role that required organization, follow-through, and enforcing procedures. Friends described her as assertive and opinionated, especially in group settings where she felt order was being ignored. She often inserted herself into situations without being asked, convinced that problems escalated only because others failed to act quickly enough. Pamela attended the gathering with friends and acquaintances to celebrate the holiday. Alcohol was present throughout the afternoon, and guests moved freely between boats and the dock. The structure was older, built for light foot traffic rather than sustained crowds. Wooden planks showed visible wear, with gaps widening near the edges. Beneath the surface, submerged support beams sat just below varying water depths due to fluctuating lake levels that summer. As the afternoon progressed, congestion increased along the dock. A large cooler filled with ice and drinks had been placed near the edge earlier in the day to serve people stepping off boats. Several guests had already mentioned that it should be moved back toward the center once traffic increased. One man began preparing to relocate it, but was waiting for help to lift it safely, as it was heavy and partially wedged against the planks. Pamela noticed the cooler and became visibly irritated. Witnesses later stated she complained that it was blocking movement and creating a hazard, insisting it should not be there at all. When told it would be moved shortly, she dismissed the explanation and continued gesturing, positioning herself closer to the edge of the dock as she argued. Rather than waiting, Pamela stepped toward the cooler and kicked it sharply, attempting to force it away from the edge. The sudden movement shifted her weight backward. At the same moment, her heel slipped into a widened gap between two planks. With no railing to stop her, she lost balance and fell backward over the side of the dock. Pamela went headfirst into the water, striking a submerged wooden support beam with significant force. The impact fractured her cervical spine. She lost consciousness immediately and sank briefly before resurfacing near the dock. Several guests witnessed the fall and shouted for help. 2 people entered the water, while others tried to locate her position from above. Rescue efforts were delayed by limited visibility and submerged beams obstructing movement. Pamela was pulled from the water several minutes later and laid flat on the dock. Emergency services were called immediately. First responders arrived by boat and shoreline access within approximately 10 minutes. Pamela showed no signs of consciousness and was not breathing effectively. Resuscitation efforts began on scene but were unsuccessful. The medical examiner determined death resulted from blunt force trauma to the neck combined with drowning. The spinal fracture prevented voluntary movement or effective breathing. Toxicology testing showed alcohol present, but not at incapacitating levels. Investigators documented overcrowding beyond the dock's intended capacity and cited the owner for failing to post occupancy warnings. The death was ruled accidental. The gathering ended immediately, and the dock was later modified to restrict future events. It was October 22, 2017, in Paramus, New Jersey. A major weekend sale packed a suburban shopping center with cars and pedestrians. Traffic stalled in narrow lanes, horns sounded, and shoppers moved between idling vehicles as congestion erased any margin for error. Lorraine Buckley was 51 and had shopped at the center for years. She planned her errands carefully and arrived that afternoon with a short list built around bundled discounts and limited quantity deals she didn't want to miss. She believed being early and prepared entitled her to move through the process without delays. When other shoppers disrupted that expectation, she tended to see it as unfair behavior rather than normal congestion. She preferred a specific parking area close to the main entrance, which she considered her usual spot due to how often she used it. That afternoon, she arrived expecting heavier traffic because of the sale, but did not anticipate how crowded the lot had become. As she crept through the lanes, frustration mounted. The delays conflicted with her plan to get inside quickly before popular items sold out. The parking lot was laid out with angled spaces, concrete wheel stops, and narrow drive lanes bordered by pedestrian walkways. A slight downhill grade ran through the central aisle, subtle, but enough to allow a vehicle to roll if it was not fully secured. Surveillance cameras mounted on tall light poles monitored entrances and several sections of the lot. After several minutes of waiting, Lorraine saw a vehicle back out of a space near the entrance, one she regularly used during past visits. Before she could reach it, another driver approached from the opposite direction and pulled in first. Lorraine slowed anyway, lingering in the lane as if the space had been hers to take. Traffic stacked behind Lorraine, blocking her path forward. Instead of continuing on, she stopped her car in the traffic lane and stepped out to confront the driver who had already parked, insisting the space had been hers to take. In her frustration, she left the engine running and did not fully place the transmission into park. The lane sloped slightly downhill. As Lorraine stood beside the open driver's door, the car began to roll backward. The movement was slow but steady. With the door open and a concrete parking barrier directly behind her, there was no space to step clear. Within seconds, the vehicle pinned her between the door frame and the barrier. Nearby, shoppers witnessed her chest being compressed against the barrier and rushed to help. Several pushed the vehicle forward while another person climbed into the driver's seat to stop it. Emergency services were called immediately from nearby storefronts. Paramedics arrived within minutes and found Lorraine unresponsive, suffering from severe blunt force trauma and ineffective breathing. Resuscitation efforts were attempted but unsuccessful. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner determined the cause of death was traumatic compression of the chest and abdomen, resulting in collapsed lungs and extensive internal bleeding. Investigators found no mechanical defects in the vehicle. Surveillance footage confirmed the car had not been secured before she exited and showed no interference by other drivers. The death was ruled accidental and attributed to driver error. The shopping center later installed additional signage reminding drivers not to stop in traffic lanes and to secure vehicles before exiting. The opposing driver was cleared of responsibility, and the case was closed after administrative review. It was December 17, 2017 in Quezon City, Philippines. A small Christmas gathering was underway inside a mid-rise condominium unit, decorated with string lights, a compact artificial tree, and wrapped gifts clustered beneath it. The unit was warm and crowded, with movement flowing between the living room and a narrow hallway that led toward the building's interior stairwell. Holiday music played softly, and the mood was relaxed as the group prepared for a simple exchange gift. Marissa Delgado was 42 and had joined 3 close friends for the exchange. Although the gift rules had been agreed on well in advance, she had postponed shopping until the last minute and arrived with an unwrapped item in a plain bag. Inside the unit, she barely glanced at the decorations. Her focus went straight to the gifts beneath the tree, particularly a large box positioned near the front, which she immediately associated with higher value. The group settled into the living room and began the exchange gift. Names were drawn casually, and gifts were handed out one by one. When it was Marissa's turn, she received the smallest package. Inside was a purse bag, new, clean, and appropriate for the exchange. Others smiled, but Marissa's expression tightened. The size difference stood out to her. She glanced repeatedly at the larger gift beneath the tree, convinced it represented better value. As the exchange wrapped up, Marissa grew visibly agitated. She fixated on fairness, replaying the moment in her head. Instead of letting it go, she stood and moved into the hallway, signaling for one friend to follow. The narrow corridor led past the unit's entrance toward a concrete stairwell used as a secondary exit. The lighting there was dimmer, and the sound of the party faded behind them. The discussion escalated quickly. Marissa paced while gesturing, insisting the exchange had been uneven and that she had been shortchanged. She stepped backward as she spoke, focused on the argument rather than her footing. The stairwell door behind her had been left ajar earlier to allow airflow. There was no guardrail at the threshold, only a short landing before the steps dropped away. As she continued moving, her heel missed the top step, She lost balance and fell backward into the stairwell. Her body struck the concrete steps as she tumbled down a full flight, coming to rest on the landing below. The fall was witnessed immediately by the friend following her, who called out for help. The others rushed in and found Marissa motionless at the base of the stairs. Blood was visible around her head, and her breathing was irregular. Emergency services were called at once. Paramedics arrived within minutes and attempted resuscitation, but Marissa never regained consciousness. She was pronounced dead at the scene due to severe head trauma and internal injuries sustained in the fall. The medical examiner later confirmed the cause of death as blunt force trauma to the head and torso. Toxicology testing showed no drugs and only minimal alcohol. Investigators found no defects in the stairwell or building structure. The death was ruled accidental, caused by a loss of balance during an argument. The party ended immediately. The remaining gifts stayed under the tree, unopened. It was February 6, 2018 in Toledo, Ohio. Snow lined the sidewalks of a quiet residential block where a row of duplexes sat under dim streetlights. Inside one unit, the evening was uneventful. Maintenance requests were normally handled through a standard property system, with non-urgent issues scheduled days in advance. Nothing about the night suggested it would end in an emergency. Marcia Klein was 39 and worked in retail management. Co-workers described her as demanding and impatient, often escalating minor issues into confrontations. She expected immediate results and treated delays as personal slights. That same attitude had followed her home. Over several months, she had repeatedly clashed with property management, calling frequently and accusing staff of negligence over small inconveniences. That evening, a decorative glass lamp in her living room stopped working. It was not wired into the unit and had no connection to the building's electrical system. Property management explained that decorative items were the tenant's responsibility and did not qualify for emergency repair. Marcia reacted angrily, accusing staff of refusing to do their jobs and threatening to withhold rent. After several minutes of shouting, she ended the call and decided to fix the problem herself. Rather than replacing the lamp or waiting for a repair service, Marcia searched online and convinced herself the issue was a simple wiring fault. She believed professional repairs were unnecessary and intentionally overpriced. Ignoring manufacturer warnings printed on the lamp's base, she retrieved a screwdriver and extension cord from a storage closet. She placed the lamp on her kitchen counter near the stovetop and began dismantling its base. The wiring inside showed visible heat damage and fraying. Instead of disconnecting power, Marcia plugged the lamp into an outlet to test it while continuing to work. When the lamp failed to turn on, she repositioned it closer to the stove to improve visibility, inadvertently resting the cord against an active burner. Within minutes, the insulation on the cord began to melt. As Marcia leaned over the counter, the exposed wiring sparked, the cord ignited, and flames spread quickly up the plastic casing and into the lamp's base. Startled, Marcia attempted to pull the cord away, but the fire intensified, producing thick black smoke. The smoke filled the small kitchen rapidly. Instead of evacuating, Marcia attempted to smother the flames with a dish towel, which ignited immediately. Disoriented and coughing, she stumbled backward and collapsed near the kitchen doorway. The fire burned itself out shortly after consuming the cord and lamp base. A neighbor in the adjoining unit noticed the smell of smoke and called emergency services. Responders arrived to find Marcia unresponsive inside the smoke-filled apartment. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner determined the cause of death was smoke inhalation, with high levels of carbon monoxide and soot found in her lungs. Fire investigators ruled the incident accidental, caused by improper electrical handling and refusal to disconnect power during a repair attempt. Property management records documented repeated warnings about unauthorized repairs. The case was closed without charges. Investigators noted the death was preventable and directly linked to unsafe behavior during an unnecessary confrontation with a routine household issue. It was August 18, 2015 in Bakersfield, California. Late summer heat hung over an industrial rail corridor where freight trains passed daily, often unnoticed by nearby residents. The area appeared familiar and routine to those who lived nearby, yet it carried constant risk that rarely announced itself until it was too late. Elaine Porter was 56 years old and worked in a supervisory clerical role for a mid-sized local operation. Her job required managing schedules, enforcing procedures, and meeting deadlines with limited tolerance for delay. Co-workers described her as efficient and blunt, with little patience for delays or disagreement, viewing obstacles as inefficiencies rather than warnings. She believed rules were optional when they interfered with efficiency, especially when she considered herself capable of managing the risk. Elaine lived within walking distance of an active rail line that cut between residential streets and commercial areas. Over time, residents formed an unofficial dirt footpath across the tracks, cutting less than 5 minutes off the walk while bypassing a marked pedestrian crossing 2 blocks away. Despite posted warning signs and fencing gaps, the path remained in use. Elaine used it regularly and had previously argued with neighbors who warned her about train traffic, insisting the concern was exaggerated and the shortcut harmless. On that afternoon, Elaine was returning from an errand and chose the shortcut as she had many times before. Freight traffic was heavier than usual due to seasonal shipping demands, and trains were operating at standard speeds. Warning signs prohibiting pedestrian crossing were visible on both sides of the corridor, but no crossing gates or signals were present at that location. As Elaine approached the tracks, a nearby pedestrian raised both arms and shouted, stepping toward the rails to warn her of an approaching train. She waved the warning off without slowing and stepped onto the ballast gravel between the rails. The rail line curved slightly, limiting sight distance in one direction. The sound of the approaching train blended with surrounding industrial noise. The freight train emerged from the curve, traveling at approximately 45 miles per hour. The engineer applied emergency braking immediately upon seeing Elaine, but the required stopping distance far exceeded the remaining track. Elaine attempted to rush the remaining distance, but her footing failed on loose ballast gravel never designed for speed or balance. She fell forward onto the track bed as the locomotive closed the remaining distance in seconds. The front of the train struck her with overwhelming force, causing catastrophic blunt force trauma. The train continued past the point of impact before coming to a complete stop. Nearby workers and pedestrians witnessed the collision and contacted emergency services immediately. The engineer radioed the incident as soon as the train stopped. First responders arrived within minutes but found Elaine unresponsive, with injuries incompatible with survival. Her body showed extensive trauma consistent with a high-speed train impact. There were no signs of defensive movement or prolonged suffering. The scene was secured, and rail traffic was halted during the investigation. The coroner ruled the death the result of massive blunt force trauma consistent with a high-speed train impact. Toxicology showed no intoxicants. Investigators reviewed onboard footage and braking data, confirming the engineer followed protocol and no mechanical failures occurred. The death was classified as accidental trespassing. Rail authorities reinforced fencing, removed the footpath, upgraded warning signs, and the case was closed after administrative review. It was March 19, 2016, in Mesa, Arizona. A busy grocery store prepared for a weekend surge as restocking crews worked alongside customers in tight aisles. Pallet jacks moved steadily, carts queued, and small conflicts surfaced in confined spaces. The environment appeared routine, yet the overlap of machinery and foot traffic created immediate physical risk. Sandra Holt was 54 years old and worked in a clerical records role for a regional office. Her position required accuracy, compliance, and strict adherence to procedure. Co-workers described her as methodical, rigid, and quick to correct mistakes she observed in others. She believed rules existed to prevent disorder and felt obligated to enforce them. Outside work, Sandra applied the same mindset to public settings. She regularly confronted strangers over line etiquette, spacing, and store policies. She had previously argued with grocery staff about checkout procedures and stocking practices. That morning, she entered the store during a peak restock window when inventory carts filled the aisles. The store layout featured narrow aisles lined with steel shelving anchored to the concrete floor. Restocking crews used manual pallet jacks carrying loads exceeding 2,000 pounds. Store policy instructed customers to yield during active stocking, but enforcement relied on cooperation rather than barriers. As Sandra moved through a central aisle, she encountered an employee pulling a loaded pallet jack forward. She stepped directly behind the pallet jack while it was being maneuvered and began gesturing, intentionally blocking its movement. Witnesses later stated she refused to step aside, insisting she had the right to stop the operation because customers were entitled to unrestricted aisle access. Another employee approached from the opposite direction to help guide the moving pallet through the narrow clearance, signaling that the equipment was actively in motion. The combined activity increased pressure in the confined space. The floor sloped slightly toward a refrigeration unit. The pallet jack shifted. The loaded platform rolled backward as weight transferred unevenly. Sandra remained positioned behind it. There was no warning horn or automatic brake. The metal frame struck her lower body and pinned her against a steel shelving upright. The force crushed her pelvis and compressed her torso. Shelving flexed but did not detach. Sandra collapsed as internal bleeding began and became unresponsive shortly afterward. Bystanders rushed forward. Several attempted to pull the pallet jack away while another employee called emergency services. The equipment was moved enough to free her, but she remained unresponsive. Paramedics arrived within several minutes. They found Sandra without a detectable pulse and with severe traumatic injuries. Resuscitation efforts began on scene but were unsuccessful. She was pronounced dead before transport. The medical examiner determined death resulted from massive internal hemorrhage caused by pelvic fractures and thoracic compression. Injuries were consistent with crush force from industrial equipment. Toxicology testing showed no intoxicants. Investigators reviewed store surveillance footage, which confirmed the sequence of events and showed no reckless operation by employees. The pallet jack functioned normally, and the load was within limits. The primary factor cited was deliberate pedestrian interference with active industrial equipment. The death was ruled accidental. No charges were filed. The store modified restocking procedures, adding temporary aisle closures during heavy pallet movement. The case was closed after administrative review. Authorities concluded the incident was preventable through better separation of customers and equipment, and no fault was assigned to employees involved. It was June 17, 2016, in a quiet residential neighborhood in Mesa, Arizona. The temperature sat near 104 degrees Fahrenheit in the late afternoon, and several homes on the block had backyard grills running ahead of sunset. Fences were low, and sound carried easily from yard to yard. Denise Harlow, 44, worked part-time as an office assistant for a small real estate firm and lived alone in a single-story home with a concrete patio and a standard propane grill. Neighbors described her as direct and argumentative during routine disputes, especially when she believed others were overreacting or interfering. That afternoon, Denise planned to grill food for 2 visiting relatives. The grill had been stored uncovered for months. When she connected the propane tank, it did not light on the first attempt. A neighbor working in his yard later said he smelled gas drifting over the fence and called out to mention it. Denise raised her voice in response, waved him off, and insisted the grill was working, continuing to adjust the tank and ignition without stopping. Over the next several minutes, Denise made repeated attempts to ignite the grill. The lid stayed closed during most of these attempts. One relative suggested stopping and checking the connection, or waiting until the smell cleared. Denise dismissed the suggestion and attributed the issue to trapped air in the line. Several nearby residents were outside at the time and had clear views into Denise's backyard. They later reported seeing her lean over the grill for an extended period, while repeatedly adjusting the control knobs with the lid closed. When Denise lifted the grill lid and leaned forward again, gas that had collected inside ignited all at once. The ignition produced a sudden outward flash rather than a rising flame. The burst was brief but forceful, accompanied by a sharp sound that drew immediate attention from surrounding yards. The flame struck Denise across the face, neck, and forearms. Her hair caught fire briefly as she recoiled backward, colliding with a patio chair before losing her balance and falling onto the concrete. She remained exposed to heat for several seconds before the flames subsided. People nearby reacted almost immediately. Water was sprayed toward her clothing from a garden hose while others moved toward the grill. The propane tank was shut off within moments, stopping the gas flow and ending the fire. The fire did not spread beyond the grill area. Denise remained on the patio and did not stand back up. Visible burn injuries were present on her upper body, and no attempts were made to move her before help arrived. Denise was transported from the scene for medical treatment, but died days later from complications caused by extensive burn injuries and smoke inhalation. The official cause of death was listed as complications of thermal burns with associated inhalation injury. The death was ruled accidental. In the weeks that followed, grills on the block went unused. Several residents replaced old hoses and tanks or moved their grills farther from their homes. The patio where the incident occurred remained empty for the rest of the summer, with the grill covered and untouched. It was May 28, 2016, in a big box store parking lot in Mesa, Arizona, during extreme heat under an active advisory. One of the parked cars belonged to Kelsey Hart, 29 years old. She worked part-time as a salon assistant and had brought her 2-year-old son, Owen, with her while running errands. People who knew Kelsey described her as confrontational during disputes and quick to escalate arguments, particularly in public settings where she felt wronged. Kelsey parked her car facing direct sunlight. Owen was secured in a rear-facing car seat in the back. The engine was off, and the windows were mostly closed. Later statements indicated she believed she would be inside only briefly. Inside the store, Kelsey became involved in an argument at the customer service counter over a return. Staff declined to process the refund without a receipt. The exchange escalated. Kelsey raised her voice, demanded a supervisor, and refused to step aside. Customers nearby distanced themselves as the dispute dragged on. Store staff later said Kelsey appeared flushed and overheated during the argument, wiping her face repeatedly and showing signs of physical agitation beyond the dispute itself. Outside, the heat built rapidly inside the vehicle. With minimal airflow, the interior temperature rose quickly. Owen cried at first, then grew quieter. Investigators later noted that this progression was consistent with worsening heat stress in a young child. Approximately 30 minutes later, a shopper walking through the parking lot noticed a child alone in a parked car. The child appeared flushed and did not respond to movement outside the window. The shopper tried the door, found it locked, and called 911. Another bystander used a tire iron to break the rear window. Owen was pulled from the car and carried into the shade. Several people poured water over his clothing and fanned him while waiting for paramedics. When emergency crews arrived, Owen was conscious but lethargic. Store staff alerted Kelsey, who ran toward the parking lot, still visibly agitated. Security records show Kelsey arrived moments after responders began treatment. Seeing the shattered rear window and broken glass, she immediately began shouting, directing her anger at bystanders and staff while demanding to know who had damaged her car. Despite paramedics working nearby on Owen, she moved closer, stepping through broken glass and continuing to yell without pause. Her voice remained raised as bystanders and a paramedic attempted to redirect her attention toward her child. She ignored them and focused on the vehicle, pacing near the rear door and striking the door frame with her hand. As she reached for the handle, her movement slowed. She placed a hand on the door frame and stopped speaking mid-outburst. Witnesses said her posture shifted, her balance faltered, and she appeared confused and unsteady, failing to respond when addressed. Seconds later, Kelsey staggered backward. She collapsed forward, striking her head against the base of a metal signpost at the edge of the parking row. The impact was severe. She fell onto the asphalt and remained motionless as people rushed to her aid. Paramedics focused on Kelsey, who was unresponsive with severe head trauma and no effective heartbeat. Advanced life support was attempted on scene without success, and she was pronounced dead in the parking lot. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death as sudden cardiac arrest, with the head injury listed as a contributing factor to her collapse. Heat stress and acute emotional agitation were identified as significant contributors. Owen survived and was treated for heat exposure before being released days later. In the aftermath, the store added clearer parking lot warnings about children left in vehicles during heat advisories and updated procedures to escalate such reports immediately. It was June 10, 2015, at a neighborhood park on the outskirts of Fresno, California. The late afternoon was clear and hot. A wide grass field stretched between walking paths and a small playground. Several groups were scattered across the park, sitting in shade or standing near open space. Elaine Porter, 46, worked as an office administrator and lived a few blocks from the park. Her daily walks followed a routine, usually alone and at the same time each afternoon. People who knew her later described her as decisive and impatient with situations she believed were out of order. When she felt something was wrong, she expected immediate correction. That afternoon, a group of teenagers was flying remote-controlled airplanes in an open field positioned well away from the playground and walking paths. One gas-powered aircraft was airborne, circling low before climbing again, while a second plane rested on the grass. The teens' attention remained fixed on the flight. As Elaine walked along the paved path, the airborne plane passed nearby, still several yards away and above head level. She stopped, turned toward the field, and began shouting at the teens to leave the area. Rather than continuing along the path, she stepped off the pavement and walked across the grass toward them. When she reached the group, Elaine grabbed the grounded aircraft by its wing and threw it aside. The plane slid across the grass, its frame cracking on impact. Several nearby parkgoers shouted for her to stop and move back, but she ignored them. With the second aircraft still in the air, Elaine turned toward it and raised her arms, stepping forward into its flight path. The operator reacted immediately, attempting to pull the plane away. However, the aircraft was already in a low maneuver with limited altitude. Witnesses later described the plane dipping briefly before surging forward under power. The aircraft struck Elaine at close range. Its spinning propeller cut into her upper chest and neck area before the plane broke apart on impact. She collapsed backward onto the grass as fragments scattered several feet away. The engine stalled and the propeller stopped within seconds. Witnesses reported that Elaine was unable to speak and was bleeding heavily from her upper body. Emergency services were called immediately. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but Elaine was unresponsive. Emergency treatment was initiated on scene, but her condition did not improve. She was transported to a nearby hospital, where she was later pronounced dead. The medical examiner determined the cause of death was catastrophic soft tissue injury and blood loss resulting from contact with the aircraft's propeller. The death was ruled accidental. In the months that followed, the city restricted remote-controlled aircraft use to designated zones and times, added warning signage near pedestrian areas, and redirected hobbyists to approved flying fields. No charges were filed, and the park reopened under updated safety policies. It was December 25, 2013, inside a single-story home in suburban Columbus, Ohio. The afternoon was warm, the windows were closed to keep the air conditioning in, and the kitchen was crowded with family for a Christmas gathering. Tara Whitman was 33 years old and spending a December afternoon at a family home during a Christmas gathering. She ran a small event rental business and enjoyed sharing party tricks and simple demonstrations online. Relatives later described her as assertive and hands-on, someone who often took control of situations and reacted poorly when corrected, especially around younger family members. That afternoon, several teenage nephews were preparing a cola and Mentos demonstration they'd seen online. A 2-liter bottle sat upright in the kitchen sink, positioned so the eruption would shoot upward and drain safely. A phone rested on the counter to record the experiment, but it wasn't central to the plan. Adults warned the boys not to touch or drink from the bottle once the reaction began, and to step back immediately. As they explained the steps, Tara interrupted, dismissing the precautions. She laughed at the need to step away, said they were overthinking it, and insisted she'd done similar tricks before, telling them to relax. As one of the boys reached for the Mentos, Tara abruptly lifted the bottle out of the sink. Someone told her to put it back and warned her not to drink from it. She snapped that she wasn't a child and didn't need instructions. She repositioned herself closer to the counter, leaned over the sink, and told everyone to stop interfering. At her direction, one of the nephews dropped the Mentos into the bottle she was holding. The reaction began instantly. Carbon dioxide is released violently, forcing foam and soda upward at high speed. Instead of setting the bottle down or stepping away, Tara raised it toward her mouth, appearing to attempt to drink from it despite the ongoing reaction. The pressurized liquid surged faster than expected, flooding her mouth and throat with a volume far beyond what could be swallowed or expelled safely. She immediately began coughing and choking as the bottle slipped from her grip and struck the sink. Soda and foam spilled across the counter and onto the kitchen floor. Tara bent forward, gagging and struggling to breathe. Panic set in as she tried to regain her footing while still disoriented from the sudden aspiration. As she attempted to step backward from the sink, her foot slid on the wet tile. She lost balance and fell hard, striking the back of her head and upper neck against the edge of the countertop before collapsing onto the floor. Family members later said she was still coughing and confused immediately after the fall, but quickly became unresponsive. Emergency services were called immediately. The family attempted to keep her airway clear while waiting for responders. When paramedics arrived, Tara was unresponsive on the kitchen floor, with signs of severe head and cervical trauma. Despite airway management and oxygen support, she did not regain consciousness and was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death as blunt force head trauma from the fall. Acute aspiration of carbonated liquid and a panic-induced loss of balance were listed as contributing factors. Investigators found no evidence of poisoning, equipment failure, or allergic reaction, confirming the cola and candy reaction behaved as expected. No charges were filed. It was April 21st, 2018, at a city zoo in Omaha, Nebraska. The afternoon was mild with clear skies and steady foot traffic. Families moved along walkways between exhibits, pausing at railings separating visitors from enclosures. Near one exhibit, a viewing area was partially closed with barriers and warning signs. Janelle Mercer, 31, worked as a retail supervisor and was visiting the zoo with a small group of acquaintances that afternoon. She worked as a retail supervisor and had come to the zoo with a small group of acquaintances as part of a casual weekend outing. Several visitors later recalled noticing her near a partially closed viewing area, where she became engaged in a tense exchange with staff. People familiar with Janelle described her as someone who resisted correction and frequently challenged posted rules, often dismissing safety notices as unnecessary or overcautious. The viewing area overlooked an animal exhibit, separated from the public walkway by a dry concrete moat. Beyond the main railing was a narrow, sloped maintenance ledge scattered with loose gravel and never intended for public use. A secondary barrier had been installed to keep visitors out of this restricted zone. Zoo staff said the area was closed earlier due to crowding and limited visibility. When Janelle reached the barrier, she stopped and argued that the closure was unnecessary, claiming the area looked safe. An employee explained the restriction and directed her to continue along the walkway. Janelle refused to move. Witnesses reported that she raised her voice, dismissed the warnings as exaggerated, and insisted there was no danger beyond the barrier, as nearby visitors stopped to watch. Instead of complying, Janelle climbed over it. Surveillance later confirmed that she lifted herself over the rail, one leg at a time, stepping into the restricted area. She moved onto the narrow maintenance ledge beyond the barrier. The surface was uneven, with small stones scattered across the concrete, and there were no handholds or guardrails. The space was not designed to support foot traffic. Standing on the ledge, Janelle turned back toward the public area. As she shifted her stance, her heel slid against the loose gravel. Her foot lost traction almost immediately. She reached backward toward the railing, but her hand did not connect with anything solid. Her center of gravity tipped beyond recovery. With no barrier to stop her fall, she went backward into the moat below. Several witnesses reported hearing a sharp impact as her head struck the concrete base. Her body did not move afterward. Zoo staff reached the edge of the moat within seconds, and one employee descended using a nearby access ladder. Janelle showed no signs of consciousness or voluntary movement. Emergency services were called immediately. Paramedics arrived shortly after and found her unresponsive at the bottom of the enclosure. Resuscitation efforts failed, and she was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner determined the cause of death was severe blunt force head trauma with a high cervical spine fracture, consistent with a backward fall from the maintenance ledge onto concrete. Death was determined to be instantaneous. Investigators reviewed staff statements and visitor accounts, which showed Janelle arguing with staff, climbing over a clearly marked barrier, stepping onto a restricted ledge, and falling. The barrier was intact and functioning as designed, with no equipment failure or structural defect identified. Inspectors confirmed the exhibit met safety standards and that access restrictions were in place due to crowd conditions. After the incident, the zoo added taller barriers, expanded warning signage, and increased staff presence near similar enclosures during peak hours. It was November 3, 2015, inside a busy family restaurant in St. Louis, Missouri, during a crowded dinner rush. Dawn Pritchard was 44 years old and worked as a dental office receptionist. On the evening of the incident, she stopped at a casual sit-down restaurant after finishing her shift, intending to eat before heading home. She arrived alone and was seated near the front of the dining room, close to the host stand. Employees later told investigators that Dawn was familiar to the restaurant and had been involved in prior disputes. She was known for escalating minor complaints and raising her voice until staff intervened. That evening, she called over a server and said her chicken entree was raw. Kitchen records later showed the dish reached standard internal temperature, and no other guests reported issues with the same batch. Dawn rejected the explanation. She stood from her table and moved toward the host stand, speaking loudly enough to draw attention from nearby diners. She demanded a refund and accused the kitchen of serving unsafe food. A manager offered to replace the meal or remove it from the bill, but Dawn refused both options. She threatened to report the restaurant for health violations and said she would document the kitchen herself. Despite being told to remain in the dining area, Dawn stepped past the host stand toward the swinging doors marked "Employees Only." Two staff members attempted to block her entry, but she pressed forward, forcing the doors inward as she continued shouting. The kitchen was in the middle of peak service. Near the fry station, the tile floor had a thin layer of grease mixed with water, an expected condition during active cooking hours. One cook was stationed at an open fryer filled with hot oil, operating at standard frying temperature as steam rose from the surface. Witnesses said Dawn entered the kitchen with her phone raised, still yelling accusations toward staff. Her attention remained fixed ahead. She did not slow down or adjust her footing as she stepped fully onto the slick tile. Her right shoe slid sideways almost immediately. The slip was abrupt. Dawn's center of gravity shifted forward, and she attempted to regain balance but had no traction. She fell toward the fryer well, her hip and torso striking the metal edge first. The impact pitched her upper body forward. Her forearm and part of her upper body plunged directly into the hot oil inside the fryer well. The cook closest to the fryer reacted instantly, grabbing Dawn's clothing and pulling her backward, while another employee activated the emergency shutoff. Dawn screamed as she was dragged clear of the fryer and collapsed near the doorway onto the tile floor. She remained largely motionless, breathing shallowly and irregularly. Severe oil burns were visible along her arm and side. Staff members kept her still and contacted emergency services while clearing the immediate area and shutting down nearby equipment to prevent further injury. Paramedics arrived within minutes. They found Dawn suffering from extensive thermal burns across a large portion of her body. Her blood pressure was dangerously low, indicating shock. She was briefly conscious during initial assessment but lost responsiveness shortly thereafter. She was transported under emergency conditions to a nearby hospital. Despite emergency treatment, Dawn's condition declined quickly, and she died later that night. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death as burn shock caused by extensive hot oil immersion burns, leading to rapid fluid loss, systemic inflammatory response, and cardiac failure. Investigators concluded she had forced her way into a restricted kitchen area and slipped on an active service floor. The fryer was operating normally, and no health or safety violations were found. Afterward, the restaurant added non-slip mats, installed an additional barrier at the kitchen entrance, and retrained staff on dispute escalation. No criminal or civil action followed, and the restaurant reopened the next day. It was July 19, 2018, in Tampa, Florida. A humid afternoon with heat shimmering off the pavement of a strip mall parking lot. The lunchtime rush was steady at a small cafe known for its drive-through coffee line that often wrapped around the building. Most customers waited patiently in the slow crawl of cars, but one driver stood out that day. 44-year-old Darlene Cooper, a part-time insurance clerk who came by a few times a week. Co-workers later said Darlene had a habit of recording minor confrontations on her phone, whether it was with store clerks, delivery drivers, or neighbors. That afternoon, she ordered a large hot coffee and a muffin from the cafe. When the drink was handed to her through the window, she lifted the cup, looked at the lid, and complained that it wasn't filled all the way. The worker apologized and offered to make a new one, but Darlene began raising her voice, drawing attention from other cars in line. Witnesses in nearby cars said she began shouting that she was being cheated out of her money. The cashier tried again to hand her a new cup, but Darlene tossed the one she'd been given through the open window. The coffee splashed across the counter and hit a young worker's arm. Security footage later showed staff stepping back in shock as Darlene drove forward a few feet, threw her SUV into park, and got out. She walked quickly toward the window, still holding her phone up in front of her. The video later recovered from that phone showed her yelling about poor service, demanding the worker's name, and pacing near the concrete post that marked the edge of the drive-through lane. The manager inside told her to leave, or he would call the police. Instead, she turned sharply and walked back toward her vehicle, muttering that she had evidence. Customers in line behind her recalled that she was still recording while pulling open the driver door. The air outside was thick, over 90 degrees, and the sound of idling engines mixed with her shouting. She set her phone on the dashboard mount, half inside the car, half standing outside. The door was still wide open. According to investigators who later reviewed the footage, what happened next lasted less than 5 seconds. Darlene swung her leg inside, trying to slam the door shut with her left hand while keeping her phone balanced on the dashboard mount. The engine was still running, and as she moved to sit back down, her foot pressed the accelerator instead of the brake. The SUV jerked forward with a short screech of tires. The open door hit the concrete post beside her parking space. The metal folded backward, trapping her between the door's inner edge and the car frame. The force crushed her upper chest against the steering column. The phone recording captured a burst of noise, then went still. A man 2 cars behind witnessed the entire impact. He said he first thought the vehicle had simply stalled, but when he saw Darlene's body pinned in the doorway, he jumped out of his car and ran toward her. The engine was still revving in gear, wheels spinning against the curb. He tried pulling the handle, but the twisted door was jammed against the post. Another driver shouted for someone to turn off the ignition. A woman reached through the passenger side to switch it off, but by then there was no movement from Darlene. The cafe staff locked the drive-through window and called emergency services, while the line of cars backed away to give space. Responders later said that the position of the SUV and the bent metal frame made extraction difficult. It took several minutes to pry the door loose enough to reach her paramedics, later noted severe chest trauma, consistent with high compression from the door hinge. Investigators pieced together the timeline mostly from her own phone. The video began with her ordering coffee and continued all the way through her shouting at staff, walking back to the SUV, and getting in. The final image froze on the steering wheel a split second before the sound of impact. Authorities classified the death as accidental, caused by blunt force injuries to the chest. They noted there was no evidence of mechanical failure, only driver error combined with distraction. Witnesses confirmed that the outburst over the half-filled cup lasted nearly 3 minutes before the fatal moment. By evening, the cafe reopened the lane. The bent post stayed for days while the video remained unreleased, though investigators confirmed it captured the full argument. The case was ruled an accidental death, a fatal mistake that turned an ordinary argument over coffee into a tragedy. It was March 22, 2019 in Sedona, Arizona, a bright, windy afternoon that drew steady weekend crowds to the Red Rock lookouts along State Route 89A. The Vista Point near Cathedral Rock was busy that afternoon, with tourists taking photos and families walking up the gravel trail leading to the elevated overlook. Among the visitors was 53-year-old Denise Harper, who had arrived with relatives in 2 cars after a long lunch downtown. Denise was a former receptionist who began using a small, 3-wheeled travel scooter after a knee injury she sustained during an argument at a shopping center several years earlier. According to family, she enjoyed visiting scenic areas and was confident operating the scooter on paved surfaces. That afternoon, she decided to follow her relatives partway up the viewing path, despite the posted sign restricting motorized vehicles beyond the parking lot. The trail itself was a narrow service road converted into a pedestrian path, climbing at a shallow angle before curving toward the overlook. Fine sandstone gravel lined the edges, and the drop-off on one side sloped several dozen feet down to a rocky basin. Visitors often paused midway to take pictures of the valley, leaning against the low wooden rail that served more as a marker than a barrier. Witnesses later told investigators that Denise appeared cheerful, but dismissive when others cautioned her about the trail's slope. A volunteer guide near the base reminded visitors that motorized scooters weren't recommended past the paved section, but Denise waved him off and continued upward. Family members said she insisted she knew what she was doing. The scooter's rear tires slipped occasionally on loose grit as she maneuvered around small rocks about halfway up. The incline steepened slightly. By 3:15 p.m., the family had reached a rest area just below the main overlook platform. Denise stopped a few yards behind them and took out her phone to take a panoramic photo. Witnesses nearby said she began adjusting her position to frame the background better, reversing slightly toward the open edge where the gravel thinned. Footage from another tourist's camera, later reviewed by investigators, showed the scooter's rear wheels spinning briefly before sliding over the worn edge of the trail. The combination of incline and loose rock caused the scooter to tilt backward. Denise instinctively leaned forward and turned the handlebars, but the shift in weight caused the left wheel to lift completely off the ground. Within seconds, the scooter tipped sideways and went over the slope. Several witnesses shouted as the chair rolled down the incline, striking rocks and brush before coming to rest roughly 20 feet below. Family members ran down the slope while others called 911. The fall had dislodged the scooter's seat and battery pack, both found a few feet away from where Denise lay motionless. Emergency crews from a local fire department arrived at 3:26 p.m. and used a rope line to access the area. Paramedics confirmed no signs of life at the scene. The county medical examiner later determined the cause of death as blunt force trauma to the head and upper torso, consistent with impact during a fall. Investigators from the sheriff's office documented tire marks leading from the main trail to the edge, confirming the scooter's loss of traction rather than intentional movement. The device's controls were found functioning normally, ruling out a mechanical malfunction. Authorities concluded that the fall was an accidental loss of control, compounded by unsuitable terrain. While the sign restricting motorized use was clearly visible at the trail entrance, no physical barrier prevented access. The overlook remained temporarily closed for safety assessment. Within a week, local officials installed reinforced fencing and additional signage warning visitors about unstable ground and prohibiting scooters, strollers, or wheeled equipment beyond the pavement. The family later told investigators they believed Denise had simply wanted a better view for her photo and underestimated how quickly the scooter could shift on loose rock. It was May 13, 2017, in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, a warm Saturday morning when the aisles of a local discount supermarket were packed with weekend shoppers. The steady hum of carts and checkout scanners filled the air. At Register 6, the line stretched nearly to the back of the produce section as people waited to pay for groceries and household items. Among them was Patricia Larkin, known by many in her neighborhood as Patty. She was 52, a retired librarian who lived alone on the east side of town. Former co-workers described her as outspoken, someone who never hesitated to correct others in public if she thought they were wrong. She came to the store regularly, often mid-morning on weekends when lines were longest. At around 10:40 a.m., surveillance footage later showed Patty pushing her cart past at least 5 customers in line at the self-checkout area. She positioned her cart directly behind another shopper who was placing items on the conveyor. A man in his 30s wearing a gray sweatshirt told her the end of the line was behind him. Witnesses said she looked straight at him and raised her voice, saying she didn't have time to deal with delays. Several people in line turned their heads as her voice carried through the checkout area. The man repeated himself, gesturing toward the line that extended behind the soda display. Instead of moving, Patty gripped her cart and pushed it forward, striking the back of the man's legs. The sound of metal wheels against the tile floor made several people step back. A store employee at the service counter began walking toward the commotion, but before he reached them, multiple shoppers had already started recording with their phones. The video later confirmed that the man did not retaliate. He stepped aside, raising his hands in disbelief, while Patty began unloading her groceries onto the belt. One of the witnesses, a woman near the express lane, told investigators that Patty seemed flustered and was muttering under her breath as she reached for items from her cart. Her movements were quick and jerky. Another customer, standing 2 registers away, said she complained that the store needed better trained staff. At that point, the manager on duty, identified later in reports as David Hall, approached from the customer service counter. He stood a few feet away and asked her to step aside to resolve the issue calmly. Patty turned, one hand still gripping her cart handle. Her body was angled halfway between the belt and the aisle divider. The surveillance footage captured what happened next. As she turned to respond, the front wheel of her shopping cart caught the edge of the metal guardrail that lined the base of the conveyor. When she tried to shift her foot, her right shoe slipped between the small gap near the rail. The cart tilted slightly, and she instinctively yanked her leg back to free herself. That movement caused her to lose balance. She stumbled backward, her arms flailing briefly before her body hit the floor. Her head struck the corner of a low-standing freezer that held packaged meat products near the checkout area. The impact produced a dull, heavy sound that was clearly audible on the store's security audio. Witnesses said the entire area went silent. A woman screamed for help, and several shoppers backed away, leaving their carts behind. The man she had argued with stood motionless, still holding his phone. The manager knelt beside Patty, who remained unresponsive. Another employee called 911 from the service counter while customers began clearing the surrounding lanes. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but emergency personnel later confirmed she had sustained a fatal skull fracture and brain hemorrhage from the impact. Security footage showed that the entire confrontation, from the moment she cut the line to the moment she fell, lasted less than 2 minutes. Store policy required a full shutdown of the affected checkout area, and customers were redirected to the remaining lanes. By 11:15 a.m., yellow tape surrounded registers 6 and 7, while police reviewed footage and took statements. Her cart remained across 2 lanes, half filled with groceries. Investigators ruled the death an accidental fall caused by imbalance and blunt force trauma. The store reopened that evening, adding padding to the freezer corner involved in the incident. It was September 10, 2016, in Plano, Texas, an early evening just after a passing thunderstorm. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, leaving shallow puddles across the wide parking lot of a suburban grocery complex. The wet asphalt reflected the glow of overhead lights and the red brake beams of shoppers pulling out with weekend groceries. Rhonda Ellis, 46, was a self-employed real estate agent who managed several rental properties in the area. Tenants and co-workers described her as assertive, often getting into minor arguments over parking, delivery access, or who had the right to certain spaces. Her silver crossover SUV was parked several rows from the store entrance as she waited for her husband to arrive in a second vehicle. Around 6:20 p.m., a blue sedan turned into the same aisle. Security footage later showed it slowing as it approached an open parking space only a few feet from where Rhonda was standing. As the driver angled to pull in, Rhonda stepped forward and stood in the middle of the space, motioning with her hands for the car to stop. The sedan paused, blinkers still on. The driver rolled down the window and said something, but the camera's audio didn't pick it up. Witnesses nearby later told police they heard Rhonda insisting that the space was meant for her husband, who was on his way. When the driver gave up and turned toward another row, she remained standing there for a few seconds with her arms crossed before walking back toward her SUV, shaking her head. Footage showed her pulling a set of car keys from her jacket pocket and tossing them down in frustration. The keys bounced once and landed beside a metal light pole base, where water had pooled from the earlier rain. She walked over to pick them up, unaware that the metal housing around the pole's base had been corroded for months. Maintenance records would later show that the wiring inside had been flagged for repair twice earlier that year, but never serviced. Moisture from the storm had seeped into the cracked seal, exposing a live wire that made intermittent contact with the metal casing whenever it was wet. Rhonda crouched beside the pole and reached down with her right hand. According to two shoppers across the aisle, there was a sudden blue-white flash, followed by a loud pop. Rhonda's body stiffened, and she let out a single sharp scream before collapsing sideways onto the wet ground. Her right hand was still gripping the key ring, which was partly submerged in the shallow puddle. A man loading groceries into his truck stopped when he saw the flash and realized she had collapsed. He stepped forward but froze when he noticed small sparks dancing across the puddle around the pole. Others nearby hesitated too, unsure what had happened. One shopper yelled for everyone to stay back while someone inside the store alerted employees. Within minutes, workers used cones and carts to block off the aisle, as the smell of burned plastic and faint electrical crackling filled the air. Fire department responders reached the scene at 6:31 p.m. and immediately cut power to the entire lighting circuit for the lot. Paramedics approached once the voltage was confirmed off, but Rhonda was already unresponsive. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner later identified electrocution as the cause of death, consistent with high-voltage contact through a conductive surface in standing water. Investigators found that corrosion in an underground junction had caused a short during the storm. Tests showed the current reached over 200 volts, strong enough to stop a heartbeat instantly. The store closed the section that night for inspection. Records revealed earlier repair requests were ignored. By the next day, city crews sealed all pole bases and added warning signs while planning full rewiring. It was November 8, 2015, in Mesa, Arizona, a dry, cool afternoon that brought steady weekend traffic into the Crosswinds shopping plaza. Inside the strip mall's small pet store, the usual chatter of birds and hum of aquarium filters filled the air. Employees were busy tending to customers buying food, tanks, and small animals. At around 3:20 p.m., the store's front counter area became the scene of an argument that would end in a sudden and tragic accident. The customer was 39-year-old Sharon Malloy, an office administrator and divorced mother of one who lived a few miles away. She was a regular at the store, often stopping by for bird feed and supplies. Employees described her as outspoken, known for questioning prices and frequently asking for discounts on items she thought were overpriced. That day, Sharon came in asking about a small parakeet she'd seen on a previous visit. The bird had been part of a local rescue program that worked with the shop, and its adoption fee was listed at $25 to cover care and medical costs. According to witnesses, Sharon argued that the store shouldn't charge for rescued animals. She spoke loudly enough that nearby customers turned to look. The employee at the counter, a college student working part-time, tried explaining that the fee went to the rescue organization, not the store itself. Sharon didn't accept the explanation and kept arguing, insisting the fee was unfair. She lifted a small metal bird cage from her cart and began pointing out its flaws: bent bars, a loose latch, chipped paint along the bottom edge. Witnesses said she waved it slightly as she spoke, her movements sharp enough that the employee stepped back from the counter. The store's security footage showed Sharon setting the cage down hard on the counter, then lifting it again in frustration. Behind her, Another customer quietly moved away from the register area. When she slammed the cage down a second time, its lower edge struck the electrical cord of a heat lamp that was clamped to a reptile tank nearby. The lamp jolted loose and dropped behind the counter, hitting a plastic bottle of glass cleaner stored on a lower shelf. The cleaner contained ammonia and alcohol-based solvents, common in commercial products but highly flammable. The bulb, still hot from continuous use, shattered on impact. In the same instant, the escaping vapor ignited, producing a brief but intense flash. Employees described hearing a sharp pop and seeing a burst of orange flame that spread upward from the floor to the counter. Sharon's blouse, made of lightweight polyester, caught fire almost immediately. Surveillance video later showed her stepping back in shock, waving her arms as the fabric began to melt against her skin. Two employees rushed forward. One grabbed a towel from the grooming station, while another unplugged the lamp's power cord. They managed to smother the flames within seconds, but by then Sharon had suffered severe burns to her upper torso and right arm. A customer ran outside to flag down a passing patrol car, and the officer radioed for paramedics. Emergency responders arrived within minutes and transported Sharon to a nearby burn center. She was pronounced dead later that evening due to thermal injuries and secondary complications from smoke inhalation. The fire department investigation concluded that the ignition was accidental, but preventable. Inspectors noted that the lamp's power cord had been improperly routed near cleaning supplies, and the clamp securing the fixture to the tank had loosened from repeated use. Although the heat output was within normal range, contact with the flammable vapors was enough to start the flash fire. Investigators ruled the fire an accident caused by unsafe equipment placement, with no criminal charges filed. The store closed for cleanup and repairs as inspectors documented burn damage across the counter and shelving. It reopened a week later with new glass enclosures for all heat lamps, added safety guards, and warning signs reminding customers to keep items clear of electrical cords. It was August 4th, 2017 in Eugene, Oregon. A Friday night when the downtown multiplex was packed for the late showing of a new superhero movie. The air smelled of popcorn and soda, and ushers moved between theaters cleaning up from earlier showings. Inside Auditorium 6, where the 10:30 p.m. screening was just beginning, 48-year-old Linda Sinclair had already taken a seat in the middle row, sipping from a large drink and scrolling through her phone. Linda worked as a retail supervisor at a clothing outlet nearby and was known to coworkers as outspoken and sometimes argumentative. According to friends, she often came to late movies alone after having drinks at a bar down the street that night. She had purchased a general admission ticket, but sat in a seat marked as reserved, part of the theater's new numbered seating system that had caused confusion and frequent disputes since being introduced a few months earlier. At 10:37 p.m., a couple entered and walked toward the center of the row where Linda was seated. Their tickets showed the same seat number she occupied, and they asked her to move. Witnesses said she refused, insisting she had arrived first. The couple went to get assistance, and two ushers returned a few minutes later, checking tickets under the dim theater lighting. When they asked her to move to her assigned seat, she declined. Security footage showed Linda standing, holding her phone, and arguing with staff while waiting for a manager. When he approached, she began recording, and nearby patrons started watching as the dispute grew louder. As the ushers stood their ground, Linda began stepping backward, trying to keep all three employees in her camera frame. The stadium-style seating had narrow, steep steps between each row, with just enough width for a single foot. Witnesses seated 2 rows below later said she moved without looking behind her. When her heel landed partly off the step, her weight shifted suddenly. Her left ankle twisted and she lost balance. In one motion, her body tipped backward into the aisle. The fall covered about 5 feet in elevation, enough to generate a strong impact. Her head struck the steel base of the aisle handrail before her phone slid down several steps, its flashlight still on. The theater went silent for several seconds before a man near the aisle called out for help. Staff immediately stopped the film and turned on the overhead lights. The ushers moved the crowd back while one checked for a pulse. A nurse who happened to be in the audience assisted until paramedics arrived roughly 7 minutes later. Linda was unresponsive and was later pronounced dead at the hospital from blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. Police reviewed the footage from both the theater cameras and audience phones. The investigation determined the fall was accidental and that staff had acted appropriately. Toxicology tests found moderate alcohol levels in her system, but no drugs. The medical examiner confirmed a fatal skull fracture consistent with impact against a fixed metal surface. The theater reopened the next day, but implemented new safety and seating protocols. Ushers were instructed to verify reserved seating before each showing to prevent disputes, and small warning signs were added to stairway entries reminding patrons to watch their step. Staff later said it was the first and only fatal accident the location had ever experienced, an argument that turned tragic within seconds. It was October 3rd, 2017, inside a small parish church in upstate New York, where a quiet afternoon wedding was being prepared. Several staff and family members worked quietly near the altar, adjusting aisle runners, placing floral stands, and lighting 5-foot candles, while the air carried a faint smell of melted wax. Florence Adams, 56, entered the church while preparations were underway and walked directly into the front pews despite clear setup activity near the altar. She lived alone nearby and was known to staff for repeatedly disputing seating rules, noise limits, and access during scheduled events. She seated herself in rows reserved for the ceremony and remained there as workers attempted to continue. When staff indicated the area would soon be needed and visitors were being redirected to side seating, Florence stayed in place. As preparations continued, she shifted further forward, blocking access to the aisle and forcing staff to stop and work around her presence. As workers moved through the aisle to adjust the runner again, Florence stood and began moving toward the altar instead of relocating. A coordinator and another staff member stepped in front of her path, attempting to redirect her away from the reserved area. Florence stopped and engaged them, gesturing sharply and raising her voice as nearby family members turned to watch. The exchange delayed the setup and drew attention inside the church. During the confrontation, Florence continued forward between the floral stands and the tall candle placements. She wore a long blouse and a lightweight cardigan, with loose sleeves extending past her wrists. As she passed one of the floor-standing candles, the fabric of her right sleeve brushed directly against the open flame. At first, there was no visible reaction. Several seconds later, the edge of the sleeve darkened, followed by flames spreading upward along the fabric. A sharp burning smell filled the air near the altar. Florence looked down and began pulling at the sleeve, which caused the fire to spread instead of extinguish. As she stepped backward during the struggle, her arm struck a freestanding decorative candle stand. The stand tipped and fell, spilling hot wax across the stone floor. The flame from that candle went out, but the fire on her clothing continued to burn as others nearby reacted. Witnesses described a brief hesitation as smoke rose and flames blocked access. When people moved in, the fire was contained, but the injuries were already severe. The wedding was canceled and later rescheduled at a different location. Paramedics reached Florence Adams after the area was cleared and provided emergency care before she was transported from the church. She died later that evening. The official cause of death was listed as complications from thermal burns and smoke inhalation, and the manner of death was ruled accidental. The church closed temporarily, and the altar area was restricted while repairs were made. When the church reopened, the damaged flooring near the altar had been replaced, and tall candle stands were removed from that section of the nave. It was August 11, 2015, on a humid summer afternoon in Tampa, Florida, when a routine appointment inside a small beauty salon escalated into a fatal electrical accident. The day had been busy, with clients booking services back-to-back as stylists worked to keep up with demand. The salon operated out of an older strip mall unit, with 6 styling chairs arranged in 2 rows and 2 shampoo stations along the back wall. The tiled flooring near the wash area was frequently damp from repeated hair rinses and cleanup between clients. Several customers were being serviced at the same time, and stylists moved quickly between stations, navigating cords, carts, and equipment. Marissa Cole was 42 years old. She worked in sales and was described by friends as assertive and particular about service experiences. Stylists who had encountered her previously recalled that she became confrontational when dissatisfied and was unwilling to accept delays or explanations she felt were unnecessary. That afternoon, Marissa arrived for a scheduled hair treatment and blow-dry. She was seated shortly after arrival, but grew visibly irritated while waiting, complaining about the temperature inside the salon and the pace of service. Staff members attempted to move her appointment forward to prevent further disruption and maintain the flow of the schedule. After her hair was washed, Marissa returned to the styling chair with her hair still heavily saturated. Water dripped from the ends onto the tiled floor beneath her feet. The stylist began towel drying, explaining that excess moisture needed to be removed before starting the blow-dry to prevent discomfort and equipment issues. Marissa objected and demanded that the dryer be used immediately, stating she did not want to wait any longer. Despite the stylist's hesitation, Marissa continued insisting. Witnesses later stated that she repeatedly leaned forward and gestured toward the blow-dryer resting on the counter beside the chair. In an effort to comply and de-escalate the situation, the stylist retrieved a long-used hairdryer kept beneath the station and plugged it into a nearby outlet positioned close to the shampoo area. As the blow-dryer was turned on, Marissa reached up and grabbed the device herself, attempting to direct the airflow toward her head. At the same time, she stood up from the chair, stepping onto the damp tile floor with bare feet. The combination of wet hands, exposed skin, and moisture on the floor created a hazardous situation. The electrical current traveled through the hairdryer, into Marissa's wet hands, and down through her body. She stiffened suddenly and collapsed beside the styling chair. The blow-dryer fell to the floor, continuing to run briefly before being unplugged by staff. Employees immediately cleared the area and called emergency services. Marissa was unresponsive and not breathing normally. Attempts to assist her were limited due to concerns about electrical safety and the presence of water around the fallen equipment. Paramedics arrived within minutes and initiated emergency care. Marissa was transported to a nearby hospital where she was pronounced dead later that afternoon. The medical examiner determined that the cause of death was electrocution. The manner of death was ruled accidental. Investigators noted that the combination of wet conditions, electrical equipment, and direct contact created a fatal pathway for the current. The salon was temporarily closed following the incident. Electrical outlets near wash stations were later relocated, and additional safety protocols were implemented regarding the use of electrical tools around water. It was June 14, 2016, inside a small women's clothing boutique in a suburban shopping plaza in Mesa, Arizona. The store occupied a narrow retail unit with tight aisles and 5 fitting rooms along the back wall. Each fitting room measured roughly 4 feet by 5 feet, with an inward opening door, a wall-mounted mirror, and no call button or alarm inside. Rosario Bones, 38, lived alone in a nearby apartment complex and was not publicly known. She was unemployed at the time and frequently visited retail stores during weekday afternoons. Former co-workers later described Rosario as confrontational in customer-facing environments, especially when she felt questioned or redirected. Store staff recognized her from previous visits where she had challenged sizing standards and argued over store policies. That afternoon, Rosario entered the boutique alone and moved aggressively through the racks, pulling multiple garments from hangers without checking the size tags. She selected several items at once, including a dress labeled medium, despite the same design being available in larger sizes nearby. When a sales associate suggested an alternative size, Rosario reacted sharply, dismissing the suggestion and insisting the dress would fit. Her raised voice drew attention from nearby customers as she gathered the items and headed toward the fitting rooms. As Rosario entered one of the back stalls, the associate reminded her of the store's limit on items and again offered assistance. Rosario did not respond and shut the fitting room door forcefully. Within minutes, customers in adjacent stalls heard fabric stretching, abrupt movements, and repeated impacts against the walls from inside Rosario's fitting room. The tight, non-stretch dress became stuck around her chest, pinning her arms upward and forcing her upper body into a forward-bent position she could not straighten inside the cramped stall. Witnesses later described loud fabric tearing sounds, followed by heavy movement as Rosario struggled inside the stall. Her knees were drawn beneath her, and her upper body remained compressed forward as she continued forcing the dress downward. After several minutes of movement, the noise stopped abruptly. A sales associate knocked on the fitting room door and announced their presence. When When there was no response, staff unlocked the door using a master key. Rosario was found collapsed in a seated position against the wall, still trapped in the dress. Her legs remained folded beneath her, and the inward opening door limited access inside the narrow stall. Attempts to reposition her were constrained by the confined space and the garment restricting her torso. Emergency services were called immediately. Paramedics arrived after the area was cleared and assessed Rosario inside the fitting room. She showed signs of severe respiratory distress and was removed from the stall once the garment was cut away. She was transported to a nearby hospital, where she died later that day. The official cause of death was listed as positional asphyxia during a fitting room incident, and the manner of death was ruled accidental. In the months that followed, the store renovated the fitting room area, reducing the number of stalls and increasing their size. Employees who were present later described the incident as a reminder of how quickly routine situations can escalate when warnings are ignored and space becomes a limiting factor. It was July 4th, 2015, on a sweltering 94-degree afternoon in Riverside, Iowa, as residents gathered at the town's community center for an annual Independence Day celebration. One of the scheduled attractions was a charity hot dog eating contest, held outdoors under temporary tents as spectators watched from nearby seating areas. The event had been organized by local volunteers and drew a larger-than-usual crowd due to the holiday. Contest tables were arranged in a single row, with plates of hot dogs prepared in advance and water cups placed at each position. Several dozen families stood nearby as the contest was introduced. Margaret Stevens was 53 years old. She was a retired county health department inspector who had volunteered to assist as a contest judge. People who knew her described her as strict about food safety standards and accustomed to enforcing regulations during her career. Since retirement, she had continued attending community events where she often raised concerns about safety and compliance. Throughout the morning, Margaret expressed objections to the contest format. She questioned how the food had been prepared, how long it had been sitting out, and whether the contestants were being adequately monitored for choking risks. Organizers acknowledged her concerns but proceeded with the event as planned, citing permits and prior safety checks. As the contest began, Margaret moved closer to the front of the tables. Witnesses later stated that she repeatedly leaned forward while gesturing toward the plates, pointing out what she believed were unsafe practices. Her interruptions caused brief delays but did not stop the competition. Several minutes into the event, Margaret stepped forward and reached across the contest table toward the plates of hot dogs. At that moment, she lost her footing on the uneven ground near the table edge and fell forward. As she fell, her mouth was open and positioned directly over the food on the table. A large piece of hot dog was forced into her airway during the fall. Margaret immediately began showing signs of distress, clutching at her throat and struggling to breathe. Nearby contestants stepped back as spectators moved toward her. Multiple bystanders attempted to assist her using abdominal thrusts. Despite repeated efforts, the obstruction could not be dislodged. Margaret collapsed to the ground and became unresponsive within moments. Emergency services were called immediately. Paramedics arrived within several minutes and took over care. They attempted advanced airway maneuvers and resuscitation efforts on scene, but Margaret showed no signs of recovery. She was pronounced dead shortly thereafter. The medical examiner later determined that the cause of death was asphyxiation due to choking. The manner of death was ruled accidental. The examination noted that the airway had been completely obstructed, leading to rapid oxygen deprivation. The hot dog eating contest was discontinued for the remainder of the day. In the weeks that followed, event organizers reviewed safety procedures for future gatherings, including clearer boundaries for volunteers and designated emergency response plans. No criminal charges were filed. The incident was later cited by local officials as an example of how quickly public events can become dangerous when individuals step beyond their assigned roles and attempt to intervene physically, even with the intention of preventing harm. It was December 23, 2015, on a mild 68-degree winter evening in Orange County, California, as holiday shopping traffic pushed a crowded mall parking lot to capacity. Vehicles circled continuously as drivers searched for spaces during one of the busiest shopping days of the year. The upscale shopping center had been busy since early morning. By late afternoon, most available parking spaces were occupied, and congestion had slowed traffic through the lot. Tempers among drivers were visibly strained as shoppers competed for limited parking. Karen Thompson was 41 years old and worked as a real estate agent. People who knew her described her as outspoken and prone to confronting others when she believed rules or etiquette were being ignored. She was particularly vocal about parking behavior and had previously engaged in disputes over what she considered improper use of shared spaces. After circling the lot for an extended period, Karen noticed a compact car parked in a standard space near a store entrance. Although the vehicle was properly positioned within the painted lines, Karen believed it should have used a smaller space farther away. She viewed the situation as inconsiderate given the crowded conditions. Karen parked her large SUV directly behind the compact car, preventing it from exiting. She then left her vehicle and entered the mall to shop. Before leaving, she placed a printed notice on the compact car's windshield expressing her dissatisfaction with the parking choice. Approximately 2 hours later, Karen returned to the parking lot. The driver of the compact car was standing beside the vehicle and appeared distressed. The woman explained that she needed to leave immediately to pick up her children from daycare and asked Karen to move her SUV. Karen refused. Witnesses later stated that she continued arguing over the parking issue and did not attempt to move her vehicle. The discussion grew more tense as the other driver repeatedly asked to leave. Several bystanders noticed the exchange but did not intervene. As the argument continued, Karen moved closer to the compact car and positioned herself near the driver's side door. When the other woman attempted to open the door to enter her vehicle, Karen stepped between the door and the car, attempting to prevent her from getting inside. The situation escalated physically when Karen reached for the car door handle as the other driver pulled it open. The sudden movement caused Karen to lose her balance. She fell backward onto the concrete surface of the parking lot, striking the back of her head. The compact car's owner immediately called 911 and attempted to assist Karen, who was unresponsive. Nearby shoppers gathered as emergency services were dispatched. Paramedics arrived within 7 minutes and began resuscitation efforts at the scene. Despite emergency care, Karen Thompson was pronounced dead in the parking lot. The medical examiner later determined that the cause of death was blunt force head trauma, resulting in a fatal brain hemorrhage. The manner of death was ruled accidental. Authorities reviewed the incident and found no evidence of criminal intent. The investigation concluded that the fatal injury occurred during a physical confrontation initiated over the parking dispute. The mall remained open and no charges were filed. It was May 7, 2020, on a mild 75-degree spring morning in Nashville, Tennessee, when a routine grocery store visit escalated into a fatal accident during a period of heightened tension over public safety rules. The grocery store was operating under temporary safety policies that morning, including posted signage requesting face coverings inside the building. Staff members had been instructed to remind customers of store rules and to contact security if disputes arose. The store was moderately busy, with shoppers moving through the aisles and employees restocking shelves. Deborah Williams was 41 years old and worked as an insurance claims adjuster. In the months leading up to the incident, she had become increasingly confrontational during public interactions, particularly when she felt rules were being enforced unfairly. She frequently recorded herself during disputes, posting videos online to document her experiences. That morning, Deborah entered the store without following the posted safety requirements. She began recording on her phone as she walked through the entrance, speaking toward the camera while moving through the front area of the store. Several customers noticed the behavior and stepped away. Store security approached Deborah near the produce section and attempted to redirect her toward customer service. Witnesses later stated that she refused to comply and continued filming while arguing with staff. The exchange drew attention from nearby shoppers, and employees requested additional assistance. As the situation continued, Deborah moved toward the front of the store. Still holding her phone, she climbed onto a stationary shopping cart near the entrance area, using it as a platform to continue addressing the people around her. Employees instructed her to step down, citing safety concerns. While standing on the cart, Deborah shifted her weight and gestured with her free hand. The cart rolled slightly, causing her to lose balance. She fell backward off the cart and struck the back of her head on the concrete floor. Nearby shoppers immediately backed away as Deborah lay motionless on the floor. Store employees called emergency services and attempted to keep the area clear. Deborah was unconscious and bleeding from a head wound. Paramedics arrived within minutes and began emergency care. Deborah was stabilized and transported to a nearby hospital. Despite treatment, she was pronounced dead approximately 2 hours later. The medical examiner determined that the cause of death was traumatic brain injury resulting from blunt force trauma to the head. The manner of death was ruled accidental. Store security reviewed surveillance footage, which confirmed that Deborah had fallen after standing on the shopping cart. No evidence of physical contact by others was found. Authorities determined that no criminal charges were warranted. The incident prompted the store to reinforce safety policies regarding customer conduct and the use of equipment inside the building. Employees later described the event as a reminder of how quickly confrontations can escalate when individuals place themselves in unsafe situations. It was April 18, 2017 in Portland, Oregon. A cool weekday evening inside a converted warehouse that now housed an indoor axe-throwing venue. The space was busy with after-work groups filling the lanes, music playing softly over the sound of axes hitting wood. One of the groups came from a regional shipping company based nearby. The outing was informal, meant to replace a canceled happy hour. Most of the group had never thrown an axe before and treated it like a novelty. One of them was Evan Miller, 29 years old, a junior logistics coordinator who had worked at the company for just over a year. He wasn't a manager, wasn't well known, and didn't stand out at work except for his habit of turning casual activities into competitions. Coworkers later said Evan often acted as if rules slowed things down. He liked moving quickly and disliked waiting his turn. Before the outing, he had watched several online videos about axe throwing and arrived confident he understood the basics. Before anyone picked up an axe, a staff member led a safety briefing. The rules were standard. Only one person throwing per lane, no stepping past the line until all throws were finished, and clear verbal confirmation before anyone retrieved an axe. The staff member demonstrated where to stand and how to wait. Several people in the group nodded along. A few later recalled Evan making quiet jokes and brushing it off. The group was assigned a single lane and rotated turns. Evan threw second. His axe hit low on the target and stuck close to the bottom edge. It wasn't a clean throw. He stepped back behind the line as instructed. As the next co-worker stepped into position to throw, Evan moved forward again. Witnesses said he appeared impatient and wanted to reset quickly. He stepped past the throwing line without saying anything and walked toward the target. No one stopped him in time. At the same moment, the next thrower released their axe. They believed the lane was clear. The throw followed a normal path toward the center of the target. Evan had already bent forward, reaching down to pull his axe free. The thrown axe struck him in the upper back and neck area. Several people shouted at once, but the release had already happened. Evan collapsed at the base of the target. People nearby froze for a moment, trying to understand what they had just seen. Staff ran toward the lane and ordered everyone else to step back. The rest of the group stood behind the line, silent. Witnesses later said the sequence happened in seconds, with no clear pause between Evan stepping past the line and the axe being released. The safety sign posted beside the lane stated that no one was allowed forward until all axes were down. The venue closed early that night, and the group was removed from the lanes. Evan died from catastrophic neck trauma caused by a direct axe strike. The venue suspended operations for the remainder of the week and reviewed its lane control procedures. No changes were made to the lane layout or posted safety rules, which remained in place after the incident. It was July 22, 2017 in Phoenix, Arizona, and the late evening heat still hovered around 95 degrees Fahrenheit as most businesses in a suburban shopping mall prepared to close. The parking lot had thinned out, leaving only a handful of cars belonging to employees finishing late shifts inside the anchor stores. One of the people moving through the lot was Tommy Rodriguez, 25 years old. He had worked construction off and on, but had been unemployed for several months after a layoff. Without a car, he relied on rides from friends and short-term jobs within walking distance. Co-workers from previous sites described him as impatient and willing to cut corners when he thought the risk was low. In the weeks leading up to that night, Tommy had spent time online reading about car theft. He focused on older vehicles parked in low-traffic areas, believing they were easier targets. He wasn't experienced, but he thought forcing a steering column would be enough to get a car moving. The Honda Civic he chose was parked near the far edge of the lot. away from overhead lights. It appeared older and showed signs of wear. Tommy waited until nearby foot traffic stopped before approaching. There were no visible security patrols at that moment. After entering the car, he began working around the steering column. Using a screwdriver, he pried open the plastic housing below the steering wheel. The cover cracked and fell away, exposing wiring and metal brackets underneath. Witnesses later said the interior light flicked on and off as he shifted in the seat. Tommy tried to force the column lock rather than carefully removing components. In the process, several wires were pulled loose. Insulation tore where the wiring rubbed against sharp metal edges inside the column. He continued working, unaware that exposed wiring was now pressed against the metal frame. Within minutes, the damaged wires began to overheat. The electrical short did not cause open flames at first. Instead, insulation slowly melted, producing smoke that gathered beneath the dashboard. At first, it stayed low, but as Tommy remained inside the car, it spread upward into the cabin. The smell of burning plastic filled the interior. Visibility dropped quickly. Tommy stayed in the driver's seat longer than expected, likely trying to correct the problem or avoid drawing attention. By the time he tried to exit, smoke had already filled most of the cabin. Witnesses later said the driver's door was partially blocked by the way the car was parked close to a concrete curb. In the low visibility, Tommy struggled to orient himself. He did not exit the vehicle. A mall security guard noticed smoke rising from the parked car roughly 20 minutes later. By the time the door was opened, the interior was heavily smoked, with minimal visible flames. Tommy died from smoke inhalation caused by an electrical fire inside the vehicle. The shopping center temporarily restricted access to that section of the parking lot, while the damaged car was removed. No structural changes were made to the lot afterward. It was October 31st, 2015, in Salem, Massachusetts, a cool Halloween night with temperatures around 52 degrees Fahrenheit. The historic downtown area was crowded with visitors moving between themed attractions, street events, and haunted houses operating at full capacity for the holiday. One of those attractions was a small seasonal haunted house set up inside a repurposed commercial building. The interior was divided into narrow rooms connected by short corridors, filled with fabric walls, wooden props, artificial fog, and low lighting. The attraction relied on timed group entry, moving visitors through scenes every few minutes. Working that night was Derek Walsh, 28 years old, a part-time scare actor who had been with the attraction for 2 seasons. He was a community college student studying theater and worked seasonal entertainment jobs to support himself. Supervisors later described him as reliable but prone to adding small changes to his scenes to get stronger reactions. Derek's assigned role was in the final room, a mock cemetery scene. His position required him to remain hidden until groups entered, then step forward from behind a prop to deliver a scare before guests exited. The room already used dim lighting and fog to limit visibility. In the weeks leading up to Halloween, Derek had begun adding his own equipment to the scene. Without approval, he brought in additional lights and plugged them into an existing power strip behind the set walls. He believed brighter flashes would improve timing and visibility during his scare. Co-workers later said he had been told not to modify electrical setups without permission. On Halloween night, the attraction was running continuously. Groups entered every few minutes, and staff had little downtime between scenes. Derek remained in position as the cemetery room cycled visitors through. As the night progressed, the added electrical load began to strain the power strip hidden behind the fabric wall. Multiple lights, fog equipment, and sound effects were drawing power from the same source. The strip overheated, and insulation around the wiring began to soften. Smoke first appeared behind the set wall, unnoticed by guests moving through the room. With the fog already thick, the early signs blended into the atmosphere. Derek stayed in place, likely assuming the smell was part of the equipment or the fog effect. Within minutes, the smoke grew heavier and darker. Heat from the overloaded wiring caused nearby fabric to smolder, producing more smoke rather than open flames. Visibility dropped further, and breathing became difficult inside the enclosed space. Witnesses later said Derek did not leave the room immediately. He was last seen moving toward the hidden equipment area, possibly trying to locate the source or shut it off. The narrow layout and low lighting made movement difficult as smoke continued to build. Guests exiting the attraction reported coughing and alerted staff. By the time the scene was cleared, the room was filled with smoke, and Derek was found unresponsive near the rear wall. Derek died from smoke inhalation caused by an electrical fire behind the set. The attraction closed for the remainder of the night, and the damaged equipment was removed. No additional effects were added to the scene after the incident. It was June 3, 2018, in Miami, Florida, a humid summer afternoon with temperatures reaching 88 degrees Fahrenheit. An abandoned hotel near the waterfront had been vacant for years. Its lower floors sealed off, but its rooftop still accessible through a damaged service stairwell. The building overlooked the city and the bay, and despite being officially closed, it had become a quiet destination for people looking for dramatic views and photos. That afternoon, Ashley Martinez, 23 years old, climbed the stairwell alone. She was a certified fitness instructor who had been out of steady work for several months. During that time, she had focused heavily on posting videos online, most of them filmed by herself using a phone and a small tripod. Her content mixed workout clips with increasingly risky stunts meant to draw attention. Ashley's online following was small, numbering fewer than 200 regular viewers. She watched content from other creators who posted rooftop dives and high jumps into pools at resorts and private villas. The videos often showed clean entries and dramatic splashes, but rarely included information about pool depth, safety checks, or supervision. Ashley believed that attempting a similar jump could set her apart. The rooftop pool at the abandoned hotel still contained water, collected from rain and partial upkeep. From the roof's edge, the surface appeared calm and dark, reflecting the sky. There were no visible depth markings, and the waterline suggested the pool was filled enough for swimming. In reality, the pool had not been maintained to full depth in years, and was far shallower than it appeared from above. Ashley set up her phone shortly after 2:30 p.m., placing it on a low wall aimed toward the pool. She began a live stream, adjusting the angle several times to frame the jump clearly. The video showed her walking along the rooftop, pointing toward the pool and stepping carefully onto the narrow ledge near the edge. The height from the roof to the pool surface was approximately 120 feet. From that distance, it was difficult to judge the depth of the water accurately. Ashley did not test the pool, throw objects into it, or attempt to measure the depth in any way. She did not use flotation devices, safety lines, or have anyone present to assist. After positioning herself on the edge, Ashley paused for several seconds. The live stream captured her looking down, shifting her footing, and raising her arms briefly for balance. Then she jumped. Viewers watching the stream saw her fall straight downward, entering the pool feet first. The impact was immediate. The shallow water provided almost no resistance, and her body struck the bottom of the pool almost instantly. There was no movement after the impact. The camera continued recording, showing ripples spreading across the pool before settling. Comments on the live stream quickly changed from encouragement to alarm as viewers realized she was not resurfacing. People nearby reached the rooftop after being alerted, but Ashley remained unresponsive in the water. The phone continued streaming until the battery ran out. Ashley died from massive blunt force trauma caused by a fall into shallow water. Access to the rooftop was later restricted by the property owner, and the pool was fully drained after the incident. It was December 14, 2016, in Anchorage, Alaska, with temperatures hovering around 8 degrees Fahrenheit, as darkness settled early over a remote lake north of the city. The surface appeared frozen and snow-covered, but local fishing reports had warned that recent temperature swings and moving water beneath the ice had created unsafe conditions in several areas. That evening, Michael Thompson, 35 years old, arrived alone with basic ice fishing gear. He had worked in oilfield support roles for years and was familiar with cold weather environments. In recent months, he had begun documenting outdoor activities online, posting videos of solo camping and fishing trips. His audience was small, but he routinely filmed his outings. Michael had chosen the lake because it was quiet and easy to access. He parked along a plowed service road and walked several hundred yards onto the ice, carrying an auger, a folding chair, and a small shelter. He did not check posted warnings near the access point that advised anglers to avoid areas close to the lake's inlet. The inlet, where a narrow stream fed into the lake, was partially covered by snow. Beneath the surface, water movement prevented the ice from forming evenly. Experienced fishermen avoided the area, knowing that ice thickness could change suddenly over short distances. Michael set up within that zone. He drilled a test hole and saw ice that appeared solid at the surface, though thinner than expected. He continued anyway, drilling additional holes nearby to set lines. The holes were placed close together, further weakening the surrounding ice. As he worked, the ice produced faint cracking sounds, common near moving water but often ignored by inexperienced anglers. Michael repositioned his chair and equipment several times, concentrating weight over the same section of ice. At approximately 6:20 p.m., as he stood to adjust one of the lines, the ice beneath him fractured. The break spread quickly from the clustered drill holes toward the inlet. Within seconds, the surface collapsed. Michael fell through into the water below. The temperature of the lake was near 32 degrees Fahrenheit. The shock was immediate. His heavy winter clothing absorbed water and added weight, making it difficult to stay afloat. The ice edge crumbled as he attempted to pull himself out. Each movement caused more breakage, widening the opening. The current beneath the ice, subtle but constant near the inlet, pushed him away from the solid edge. With no one else on the lake and no immediate assistance available, Michael remained in the water. His movements slowed as cold exposure set in. The surrounding ice prevented him from finding a stable exit point. The area remained undisturbed until the following day, when another angler noticed equipment frozen into the ice near the inlet and alerted authorities. Recovery teams later confirmed that Michael had fallen through thin ice near moving water. The cause of death was cold water immersion after ice failure. The location where he entered the lake was later marked as unsafe due to persistent thin ice caused by the inlet flow. It was August 17, 2014, in Las Vegas, Nevada, with afternoon temperatures reaching 104 degrees Fahrenheit. In a quiet residential neighborhood, most people stayed indoors to escape the heat. Inside one garage at the edge of a single-story home, a series of amateur experiments had been taking place for months. The garage belonged to Kevin Brooks, 31 years old. He lived alone and had recently begun uploading videos to a small YouTube channel focused on backyard science demonstrations. His content involved visual experiments meant to look impressive on camera, usually filmed without assistance. The channel had a modest audience and no formal sponsorships. Kevin's setup was basic. A folding table held containers, tools, and safety goggles that were rarely worn. The garage door was kept partially closed to reduce glare and outside noise during filming. There was no ventilation system beyond a small fan placed near the back wall. In the weeks leading up to the incident, Kevin had been working on a fireworks-related experiment. He was not licensed and had no formal training in pyrotechnics. He relied on online videos and forum posts to guide his work. The goal was to produce a louder and brighter effect than anything he had previously filmed. On the afternoon of August 17th, Kevin prepared materials inside the garage. He worked alone, with the camera positioned several feet away to capture the setup. The materials were placed into a metal container that was not designed to handle pressure. Kevin sealed the container to prevent spills, unaware that confinement significantly increased the risk of failure. As he continued preparing the experiment, heat inside the garage steadily built. The temperature, combined with friction from handling and transferring materials, created unstable conditions. Kevin moved the container onto the work surface, positioning it close to himself so it would remain in frame. At approximately 3:40 p.m., Kevin attempted to adjust the container while the camera was recording. Witnesses later reviewing the footage noted a brief pause, followed by a sudden rupture. The sealed container failed under internal pressure. The resulting blast was not a cinematic explosion, but a rapid release of force inside the enclosed space. Shrapnel from the container struck nearby surfaces. The shockwave caused immediate structural damage to the garage interior. Kevin was standing within arm's reach of the work table when the sealed container failed. The sudden release of pressure sent fragments of metal and debris across the garage, knocking equipment to the floor and filling the enclosed space with dust and smoke. The camera recording the experiment fell onto its side but continued running as visibility dropped. Neighbors reported hearing a sharp explosion, followed by the sound of breaking objects. Several stepped outside and saw smoke coming from the partially open garage door. Emergency services were contacted within minutes. Fire crews and paramedics arrived and secured the area, initially treating the scene as a hazardous materials incident due to the presence of unknown chemicals and damaged containers. After the garage was cleared enough to allow access, paramedics confirmed that Kevin had sustained fatal injuries from the blast. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Investigators later identified the cause of death as blast trauma, resulting from the failure of a sealed pyrotechnic container. Remaining materials were removed once the area was deemed safe. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.